What would you do if you happened to witness a brutal murder, and the only way to escape was to knock on the door of the most dangerous man in the city? Today, I'm going to recount the unbelievable true story of Rachel Morgan, a pediatric nurse who thought she was in for just another late-night shift at Manhattan General Hospital. But when she left work around 3 a.m. and took a shortcut down the wrong alley, she witnessed something that would irrevocably change her life. In a desperate attempt to flee from ruthless killers, Rachel inadvertently knocked on what she thought was her friend's apartment door. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with Matteo Ricci, a formidable 42-year-old Italian mafia boss. He took one look at her terrified face and uttered a declaration that would forever alter both of their destinies. From now on, you live here. This story has everything you could want. A brutal crime, life or death chases through dark city streets, a mysterious protector with deadly secrets, and a love that blossoms from the most perilous circumstances imaginable. Rachel Morgan pushed through the heavy glass doors of Manhattan General Hospital, her scrubs rumpled and her feet throbbing after a particularly grueling 12-hour shift in the pediatric intensive care unit. At 28, she had been a nurse for 6 years, but tonight had truly tested even her experienced reserves of compassion and energy. She had spent the entire evening caring for 7-year-old Miguel, who had been brought in after a devastating car accident that had tragically also claimed his mother's life. The boy was stable now, but he would awaken tomorrow to a world where absolutely everything had irrevocably changed. And Rachel's heart ached just thinking about the agonizing conversation that someone would inevitably have to have with him. The shift had been especially brutal, even by the already demanding standards of the pediatric ICU. Besides Miguel, Rachel had also treated a 4-year-old girl named Sophie, who had been admitted with deeply suspicious injuries that strongly suggested abuse, and twin babies who had been born prematurely to a mother addicted to opioids. Each and every case represented a different kind of tragedy, a different and heartbreaking failure of the very systems that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable among us. Rachel had initially gone into nursing because she had genuinely wanted to heal people, to make a tangible and meaningful difference in the world. But after 6 long years in pediatric care, she sometimes felt as if she was just applying bandages to wounds that society kept stubbornly reopening, over and over again. She diligently saved the children who made it to her unit, pulling them back from the brink. But she couldn't protect them from returning to the same dangerous environments, the same deeply ingrained systemic problems, the same vicious cycles of poverty and senseless violence that had hurt them in the first place. It was precisely 3:17 a.m. according to the large digital clock positioned above the hospital's main entrance, and the city streets were mostly deserted, save for the occasional taxicab and the dedicated people who belonged to the unseen night shift of urban life. Rachel normally took the subway home to her small, somewhat cramped apartment in Queens, but tonight she was planning on staying at her friend Lisa's place in Manhattan. Lisa Chun was another pediatric nurse who lived in a converted brownstone apartment building about 15 blocks from the hospital. She had generously offered Rachel her couch for the night since Rachel had to be back at work bright and early by 7 a.m. for a dreaded double shift to cover for a colleague who had unexpectedly called out sick. It would save Rachel nearly 2 precious hours of commuting time, and she desperately needed every single minute of sleep that she could possibly get. The quickest route to Lisa's apartment led through a combination of well-lit commercial streets and quieter, more secluded residential blocks. Rachel had walked this particular path dozens and dozens of times over the past 3 years, usually feeling relatively safe and secure in the familiar neighborhood, even at such late hours. But tonight, completely exhausted and emotionally drained from the exceptionally difficult shift, she impulsively decided to take a shortcut through a narrow alley that would shave approximately 5 minutes off her walk. It was a seemingly small decision that would irrevocably change absolutely everything. The alley ran directly behind a row of upscale restaurants and boutique shops, connecting 2 main streets, and generally served as a delivery route during regular daytime hours. At 3 a.m., however, it was completely empty and poorly lit, with ominous shadows that seemed to move independently of their apparent sources. Rachel walked quickly, her sneakers making hardly any sound on the rough asphalt, eager to make her way through the narrow, slightly claustrophobic space and back to the reassuringly well-lit sidewalks. She was about halfway through the alley when she distinctly heard voices speaking in what sounded unmistakably like Russian, coming from behind a large dumpster near the back entrance of a popular Italian restaurant. Rachel's very first instinct was to immediately turn around and simply take the longer way around, but a combination of curiosity and genuine concern made her pause. What if someone was seriously hurt? What if there was a medical emergency of some kind? Rachel moved closer, carefully staying hidden in the shadows, trying to determine whether or not her help was actually needed. As her eyes gradually adjusted to the almost complete darkness, she made out 3 men standing menacingly around a 4th figure, who was kneeling on the ground, his hands tightly bound behind his back. Even in the dim light, Rachel could clearly see that the kneeling man was bleeding profusely from multiple grievous wounds on his face and torso. His undeniably expensive suit, what had probably been a perfectly tailored Italian design only hours earlier, was now torn and completely soaked with blood. A gleaming gold watch caught the faint light on his wrist, and Rachel could see that his hands were visibly shaking as he desperately tried to maintain his balance with his wrists bound tightly behind his back. "Please," he begged. "I have a family. I have children in Moscow. They are completely innocent. I will pay whatever you want. 10 million, 20 million. I have accounts in Switzerland, in the Caymans." The largest of the standing men, broad-shouldered with a completely shaved head and the kind of muscular build that clearly came from years of violence and intimidation, spoke in heavily accented English. "Victor Petro, you had many chances to pay. You had many chances to show respect. Instead, you think you can expand into our territory, steal our businesses, corrupt our politicians. That was just business." Victor's voice was getting increasingly desperate. "Just business. We can negotiate. We can find an arrangement." "Time for negotiation is finished," said another one of the Russians. This one was noticeably thinner, but with the same cold, dead eyes that Rachel had unfortunately seen far too many times in some of the hardened gang members who inevitably ended up in her ER. "Boss says, you are example now. Example for other families who think they can disrespect Clough organization." Rachel's blood turned to ice as she suddenly realized that she wasn't just witnessing a run-of-the-mill murder. She was witnessing a carefully planned execution that was specifically meant to send a crystal-clear message to other rival criminal organizations. This wasn't some random act of violence. It was calculated, cold-blooded political violence in a complex and dangerous war that she didn't even begin to understand. Rachel's blood turned to ice as she realized what she was witnessing. This wasn't a medical emergency at all. It was an execution, pure and simple. She desperately needed to call 911 immediately. But as she instinctively reached for her cell phone, her hand inadvertently bumped against the rough brick wall behind her, dislodging a small piece of loose mortar. The seemingly insignificant sound echoed loudly through the otherwise silent alley like the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. All 4 men instantly turned sharply toward her hiding place, and Rachel found herself staring directly into the terrified eyes of the kneeling victim. In that split second, she saw his overwhelming desperation, his stark terror, and his silent, desperate plea for help. "There!" one of the Russians shouted, pointing directly in her direction. "Someone is watching us." Rachel didn't wait even a second to see what was going to happen next. She immediately turned and ran as fast as she possibly could toward the mouth of the alley, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she distinctly heard heavy footsteps pounding loudly after her. Behind her, she could hear rapid and agitated conversations in Russian and the unmistakable sound of multiple people in hot pursuit. As she reached the relative safety of the street, Rachel chanced a quick glance over her shoulder and saw 3 men emerging from the alley, their faces hard and completely devoid of any emotion. One of them was speaking rapidly into a cell phone, undoubtedly calling for backup or additional resources to hunt her down like an animal. Rachel ran harder than she had ever run in her entire life, her nursing bag bouncing awkwardly against her hip as she sprinted desperately down the sidewalk. Her sneakers pounded heavily against the unforgiving concrete, and she could clearly hear her own ragged and labored breathing mixing with the ominous sound of heavy footsteps relentlessly pursuing her. She had witnessed a murder, or at least she had been mere seconds away from witnessing one, and the killers had seen her face clearly enough to positively identify her later. The Russians were steadily gaining on her, their longer strides and obvious physical training giving them a distinct advantage over a woman who spent the vast majority of her days on her feet, but rarely engaged in this kind of intensely strenuous cardio. Rachel could distinctly hear their voices coordinating the pursuit, speaking in rapid Russian that she couldn't understand, but that clearly concerned strategy for capturing her quickly and efficiently. Manhattan at 3:30 a.m. was a completely different world from the bustling daytime city that Rachel knew so well. The very same streets that bustled with constant activity during normal business hours were now almost completely empty, populated only by the occasional taxicab, weary late-shift workers heading home, and the kinds of shady people who actively preferred the protective cover of complete darkness for their various activities. The bright lights and crowded sidewalks that might have offered some semblance of safety during the day were replaced by long, unsettling stretches of eerie shadow and almost complete silence. Rachel's mind raced frantically as she ran, desperately trying to remember the absolute quickest route to Lisa's apartment, while also scanning for any and all signs of safety. A police car, a 24-hour business with security, even just well-lit areas with visible security cameras that might deter her determined pursuers. But the particular neighborhood she was running through was primarily residential, filled with incredibly expensive brownstones and luxurious apartment buildings, whose wealthy occupants were all sound asleep behind heavily secured doors. Lisa's apartment was still approximately 8 blocks away, but Rachel vaguely remembered that the route took her through several well-lit commercial areas where there might be security cameras or late-night businesses with people who could potentially help her. She just desperately had to stay ahead of her relentless pursuers long enough to reach safety. But as Rachel turned onto a side street that she mistakenly thought led directly toward Lisa's neighborhood, she suddenly realized that she had made a serious mistake. In her blind panic and utter exhaustion, she had gotten completely turned around. The street she was currently on was strictly residential, lined with incredibly expensive brownstones and ultra-luxurious apartment buildings. But there were absolutely no open businesses, no security guards, no any signs of life whatsoever that might possibly offer her any kind of protection. Behind her, the threatening Russian voices were getting audibly closer. Rachel spotted a tall, modern apartment building with an elegant facade and an expensive-looking entrance. The heavy glass door was slightly ajar. Someone had probably just entered or exited, and the automatic lock hadn't yet fully engaged. Without even thinking about it, Rachel darted directly toward the building and quickly slipped inside. The lobby was beautifully appointed with gleaming marble floors, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and impressive artwork that probably cost more than Rachel made in an entire year. But she barely even noticed the opulence as she ran toward the stairs, taking them 2 at a time in her desperate flight from the menacing men who were relentlessly hunting her. Rachel climbed floor after floor, her lungs burning intensely and her legs aching terribly, driven by pure adrenaline and utter terror. She could clearly hear the building's front door opening noisily behind her, could distinctly hear voices in the lobby speaking in Russian. They had followed her inside the building. She kept climbing rapidly past the 3rd floor, past the 5th, past the 7th, not stopping until she reached what appeared to be the very top of the building. There was only a single door on the landing, a heavy wooden door with gleaming brass fixtures that strongly suggested that this was the building's exclusive penthouse apartment. Rachel pounded frantically on the door with both fists, not caring in the slightest about the noise she was making, not caring at all about disturbing whoever lived there, caring only about getting inside and away from the menacing men who were rapidly climbing the stairs behind her. "Please," she called out desperately, continuing to bang forcefully on the door. "Please, someone help me. There are men trying to hurt me." She could distinctly hear footsteps on the stairs, getting closer and closer with each passing second. Rachel pounded even harder on the door, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face, as she realized that she might be completely trapped. Then, finally, the door slowly opened. The man who stood in the doorway was certainly not what Rachel had expected from a penthouse resident abruptly awakened at 3:30 a.m. by frantic pounding on his door. He was tall, probably around 6'2", with dark hair that showed distinguished streaks of silver at the temples, olive skin that strongly suggested Mediterranean heritage, and the kind of commanding presence that immediately demanded attention, even while wearing simple pajama pants and a fitted t-shirt. His body, clearly visible through the thin fabric of his shirt, was undeniably that of someone who maintained himself with disciplined exercise, not the overly sculpted physique of someone trying desperately to impress, but the practical strength of someone whose very life might one day depend on his physical capabilities. There was a small, faint scar above his left eyebrow, and another slightly longer one along his prominent jawline that hinted that he had definitely seen violence before. But it was ultimately his eyes that completely stopped Rachel's breath. Dark brown, almost black, with an intensity that seemed to take in absolutely everything about her current situation in a single, all-encompassing glance. They were undeniably the eyes of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly and accurately, someone who missed absolutely nothing and revealed very little. More importantly, they were the unmistakable eyes of someone who, upon seeing a terrified woman at his door in the middle of the night, immediately shifted into protective mode rather than suspicion or simple annoyance. The apartment behind him was absolutely stunning in a way that spoke volumes about both immense wealth and sophisticated taste. Rachel caught brief glimpses of floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking panoramic views of the glittering city. Expensive furniture that looked both incredibly beautiful and exceptionally comfortable, and artwork that appeared to be of museum quality rather than mere decorator-chosen pieces. But everything also had a lived-in quality that strongly suggested that this was a real home, not just a sterile showcase. Per favor, Rachel gasped in broken Italian. She had learned from working with immigrant families at the hospital. Help me. There are men. They want to hurt me. The man's intense eyes moved quickly past Rachel to the stairwell, and she could immediately see his expression subtly change as he heard the approaching footsteps and the distinct murmur of voices. His jaw visibly tightened, and something undeniably dangerous flickered briefly in his dark eyes. "Get inside," he said in accented English, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority that made immediate obedience seem almost automatic. Rachel stumbled gratefully into the apartment, and the man quickly closed the door firmly behind her, engaging multiple locks with practiced efficiency. The apartment was truly stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered breathtaking panoramic views of the entire city. Expensive, obviously custom-made furniture filled the spacious rooms, and everything spoke eloquently of immense wealth and incredibly sophisticated taste. But Rachel barely even noticed the over-the-top luxury. She was far too busy trying desperately to catch her breath and process what in the world was actually happening. "What did you see?" the man asked, his voice remarkably calm despite the obvious urgency of the incredibly dangerous situation. There were men in an alley, Russians. I think they had someone. They were going to kill him. They saw me watching." The man nodded grimly, as if this disturbing information simply confirmed something that he had already strongly suspected. "How many men?" "3 that I saw. But one was on the phone when they started chasing me. There might be more." Before the man could even respond, there was a loud and insistent banging on the apartment door. Rachel jumped nervously, but her seemingly unflappable host appeared completely unsurprised by the unexpected intrusion. "Open door," a heavily accented voice demanded from the hallway outside. "We know girl is inside." Rachel looked at the man in abject terror, but he appeared completely calm and collected. He moved purposefully to what looked like an antique desk and calmly pulled out something that made Rachel's blood run ice cold. A gun. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. "And whatever happens, do not speak unless I tell you to." The loud banging continued, accompanied by a string of menacing threats in both fluent Russian and broken English. Rachel pressed herself tightly against the wall, watching intently as the man expertly checked his weapon with the kind of practiced efficiency that strongly suggested that this was definitely not his very first encounter with armed criminals. "Listen carefully," he said to Rachel without taking his eyes off the door. "My name is Matteo Ricci. This is my home. Those men outside are my enemies, and they will not leave here alive if they actually try to enter." The name meant absolutely nothing to Rachel, but the way he said it, with quiet certainty and absolute authority, made her understand that she was somehow no longer in immediate mortal danger. "But after tonight," Matteo continued, "they will know you were here. They will know you saw their faces. They will know you can identify them. Rachel felt her heart sink as she slowly realized the terrifying implications. They'll come after me. Yes, which means your old life is over. The stark words hit Rachel like a physical blow. What do you mean? Mateo turned to look at her directly, and Rachel saw something undeniably complex in his dark eyes that was simultaneously both protective and unexpectedly possessive. From now on, you live here. Rachel stared at him in utter disbelief, trying desperately to process what he had just said. I can't. I have a job. I have an apartment. I have a life. Mateo corrected her gently. You had those things. Now you have something far more important. You have protection. The loud banging on the door had abruptly stopped, replaced by quieter, more subtle sounds that suggested that the Russians were now trying to find another way into the heavily fortified apartment. Mateo moved silently toward the windows, peering down at the street through what Rachel now realized were undoubtedly bulletproof glass. They are regrouping, he said matter-of-factly. Calling for backup, probably, but they will not try to force entry tonight. They know better. Know better than what? Mateo smiled faintly, but it wasn't particularly reassuring. No better than to start a war that they cannot possibly win. Over the next hour, Rachel gradually learned exactly who had opened his door to her, and the resulting revelation was simultaneously both terrifying and oddly comforting. Matteo Ricci was the undisputed head of one of New York's oldest Italian-American crime families, a man whose far-reaching influence extended throughout Manhattan's powerful business and political communities. The Ricci family had been actively operating in New York for nearly a century, evolving steadily from Prohibition-era bootleggers to a highly sophisticated organization that now controlled everything from waste management to lucrative construction contracts to high-end restaurants. We are not the mafia you see in the movies, Matteo explained calmly as he expertly made coffee with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the night's terrifying events. We do not run around shooting people in the streets or leaving bodies in the harbor. We are businessmen who simply happen to operate in areas where the fine line between legal and illegal is, shall we say, flexible. The Russians who had been relentlessly chasing Rachel belonged to the Koslov organization, a newer, far more brutal group that had been aggressively trying to expand their illicit influence from Brighton Beach into Manhattan's far more lucrative territories. Unlike the traditional Italian families who operated according to long-standing codes of honor and respect that had been meticulously developed over generations, the Russians were notoriously known for their willingness to use extreme violence and their utter disregard for the unwritten rules that kept the volatile criminal underworld from descending into complete and utter open warfare. The man you saw in the alley, Matteo continued, settling comfortably into a chair directly across from Rachel with his steaming cup of coffee. His name was Victor Petro. He was actually a surprisingly reasonable man for a Russian, at least. He had been actively trying to negotiate some kind of arrangement between our respective organizations to find a viable way for the Koslovs to operate profitably in New York without stepping all over established territories. So they killed him for trying to make peace. Matteo paused, taking a sip of his coffee. They killed him because someone higher up in their organization decided that negotiation was ultimately a sign of weakness. The Koslovs clearly prefer to simply take what they want rather than respectfully ask for it. Rachel sat awkwardly on Matteo's undeniably expensive couch, still wearing her rumpled scrubs, trying desperately to comprehend the utterly surreal fact that she was currently having coffee at 4 with a self-confessed criminal who had, ironically, just saved her life. So, they killed him almost certainly because he was trying to negotiate a peace treaty. And now you are the only remaining witness to their brutal crime. Which means they'll keep coming after me. Which means I will keep protecting you. Rachel nervously looked around the luxurious apartment, then back at the calm man who spoke of both extreme violence and unwavering protection with equal ease. At the completely new life she had suddenly stumbled into through a terrible combination of bad timing and even worse luck. I can't stay here. I don't even know you. This isn't my world. Matteo calmly set down his coffee cup and studied Rachel's face intently. What is your world, cara mia? 12-hour shifts spent caring for sick children? A small, somewhat cramped apartment where you live completely alone? Friends you see perhaps once a week if you're really lucky? The undeniably accurate description of her admittedly rather mundane life stung far more than Rachel wanted to admit. At least it's my life. At least I'm free. Free to be hunted relentlessly by ruthless Russian killers? Free to be murdered simply because you happen to inadvertently witness their gruesome crime? Rachel had no real answer for that. Let me tell you something about true freedom, Matteo continued, his voice surprisingly gentle but undeniably firm. Freedom is having the power to protect yourself and all of the people you genuinely care about. Freedom is not having to constantly look nervously over your shoulder every time you walk innocently down the street. Freedom is knowing, without a shadow of a doubt, that when someone threatens you, there will be very real consequences. That's not freedom, Rachel countered. That's just a different kind of prison, perhaps. Perhaps. But it is a prison where you are undeniably safe, genuinely respected, and actually valued. Can you honestly say the exact same about the life you are desperately trying to return to? Rachel thought for a moment about her somewhat depressing apartment in Queens, about her demanding job at the hospital, about the constant financial stress that never seemed to end, and the almost crippling loneliness that had slowly but surely become the constant background noise of her everyday existence. I need time to think, she said finally. Time is exactly what you unfortunately do not have, Matteo replied matter-of-factly. By tomorrow morning, the Russians will know your full name, your exact address, your place of employment. They will know absolutely everything about you that can be easily discovered through public records and various forms of social media. So what are you suggesting? I am not suggesting anything. I am simply telling you that you will stay here under my personal protection until this extremely dangerous situation is resolved. The way he said it, not as a polite request, but as a simple statement of undeniable fact, made Rachel bristle slightly. You can't just decide that. You can't just arbitrarily declare that I live here now. Matteo's hard expression softened just a bit. Rachel, look at me. Really, look at me. Rachel reluctantly met his dark eyes and saw something there that truly surprised her. Genuine concern, even unexpected tenderness. I am not keeping you here because I want to somehow control you. I am keeping you here because if you leave this apartment, you will almost certainly be dead within 48 hours. The Russians simply do not leave witnesses alive, especially witnesses who can easily identify them in the brazen murder of a high-ranking member of a rival criminal organization. The stark truth of his chilling words hit Rachel like a bucket of ice-cold water. But if I stay here, what happens to my life, my job, my friends? Your job will be told that you have a family emergency and that you need an extended leave of absence. Your friends will be told that you are visiting relatives out of state. Your apartment will be maintained and all of your bills will be paid promptly. But you cannot safely return to any of those things until the immediate threat has been completely eliminated. And how long will that take? Matteo's smile was grim. That depends entirely on how quickly I can find the men who actually saw you tonight. Rachel spent the remainder of the night in Matteo's impeccably decorated guest bedroom, lying wide awake and staring blankly at the ceiling while desperately trying to process the absolutely complete and utterly unexpected transformation of her entire existence. Just 24 short hours ago, her biggest concern had been simply getting enough sleep between her incredibly demanding shifts. Now she was a key witness to an attempted murder, living under the dubious protection of a powerful mafia boss who had unilaterally decided her long-term fate. But as the slow hours passed and exhaustion began to finally overcome her overwhelming anxiety, Rachel found herself thinking seriously about Matteo's probing questions about her rather ordinary old life. Was she really all that free when she lived constantly paycheck to paycheck? When she routinely worked herself to near total exhaustion? When she genuinely had no one to call in an emergency except overworked colleagues who were all equally overwhelmed? When she finally fell into an uneasy sleep as dawn was breaking over the vast city, Rachel's troubled dreams were filled with ominous Russian voices and the distinct clatter of gunfire. Hidden back alleys weren't the only things Rachel remembered. She also recalled the dark eyes that had witnessed her terror and then, without hesitation, moved to shield her from harm. 12 hours later, she stirred, the incredible aroma of something cooking drawing her from sleep at 12:25 a.m. She found Matteo in the kitchen, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, preparing what looked like a gourmet meal with the same calm, efficient demeanor he displayed while dealing with armed criminals. "Bonjour, Noella," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Rachel admitted, stretching slightly. "What are you making?" "Ossobuco, my Nana's recipe. I thought you might be hungry." Rachel realized she hadn't eaten since before her shift the previous day, nearly 20 hours ago. "I should call the hospital," she said. "Let them know I won't be in for my shift." "Already handled. You have been granted emergency family leave for personal reasons." Your supervisor was very understanding. Rachel stared at him, incredulous. "How did you?" "I have people who handle such arrangements. Your job is secure, and your absence won't raise suspicions." "What about Lisa? She'll be worried when I don't show up." "Lisa Chun received a text from your phone explaining that you had to leave town unexpectedly for a family emergency. She wished you well and said to call when you can." The casual way he mentioned details about her personal life made Rachel acutely aware of the extent of Mateo's power and how swiftly he had moved to orchestrate her cover story. "You've thought of everything. It's what I do. I protect people, and protection requires attention to detail." As they ate lunch, Rachel found the ossobuco incredible, far better than anything she'd ever tasted. She couldn't help but study Mateo more closely. He was handsome in a mature, sophisticated way, a far cry from the younger men she usually found attractive. But more than his appearance, it was his presence that drew her in. He moved with a quiet confidence, spoke with a natural authority, and seemed genuinely concerned for her comfort and well-being. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel ventured. "Of course. Why are you doing this?" "Really? You could have just called the police when I knocked on your door. You could have let them handle the Russians." Mateo was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Rachel saw a flicker of pain cross his features. 3 years ago, I lost my wife to men who wanted to hurt me. Maria. She was everything good in my life. A teacher who worked with immigrant children, helping them learn English and adapt to American schools. She knew about my business, but she was never a part of it. She was completely innocent of everything except loving someone in my position. Mateo's voice grew quieter, more distant. The Bratva, a different Russian organization than the Koslovs, they kidnapped her to use as leverage against me in a business dispute. They wanted me to give up 3 blocks of territory in Little Italy, businesses that had been under our protection for 40 years. Rachel felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice, but she remained silent, sensing that this was a story Mateo rarely shared. "I gave them everything they asked for immediately. Territory, money, even some of my own people as collateral. But it wasn't enough. They had decided that humiliating me publicly would send a stronger message to other families than simply getting what they wanted." Mateo stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "They kept her for 3 days. His voice broke slightly. "When we finally found where they were holding her, she had been beaten, tortured, violated. She died in my arms in the hospital, and her last words were an apology for causing me trouble." Rachel felt tears welling in her eyes. "Mateo, I'm so sorry. That's unimaginable. I spent the next 6 months hunting down every person involved in her death. Not just the ones who took her, but the ones who ordered it. The ones who knew about it. The ones who could have prevented it but chose not to. 23 people died because they took Maria from me." The casual way he mentioned such extensive revenge should have terrified Rachel. But instead, she found herself thinking about how far she would go to protect someone she loved, and whether the men who had tortured an innocent woman to death had deserved mercy. After a moment, Mateo continued, "I swore that I would never again allow an innocent person to be harmed because of the world I live in. When I saw you at my door, terrified and hunted by my enemies, I saw Maria. I saw a chance to keep a promise I made at her grave." "I'm sorry," Rachel said softly. "I can't imagine losing someone like that. Changes you. It makes you understand that some things are more important than law, more important than convention, more important than what other people think is right or wrong." Rachel thought about the victims she had treated in the pediatric ICU, about the families destroyed by violence and accidents and diseases that didn't discriminate between good and evil. At the hospital, I see a lot of people who get hurt because the system fails them. Kids who don't get proper medical care because their families can't afford it. Women who get beaten by men the police won't arrest. Elderly people who get scammed because there's no one to protect them. And what do you do about it? What I can. But it never feels like enough. Matteo nodded thoughtfully. That is the difference between people like you and people like me. You work within a system that is broken and try to help whoever you can reach. I work outside the system and fix problems that the system cannot or will not address. By breaking laws, by doing what needs to be done. Rachel couldn't argue with the logic, even though it challenged everything she had been taught about right and wrong. Over the following days, Rachel settled into an unexpected routine in Matteo's penthouse, and she learned that he was far more complex than she had initially understood. Yes, he was the head of a criminal organization, but he was also a man who read voraciously. His personal library included classics in Italian, English, and French, as well as biographies, philosophy, and contemporary fiction. He cooked with the passion of someone who found genuine joy in creating something beautiful and nourishing. He spoke 4 languages fluently and could discuss everything from Renaissance art to modern political theory to the finer points of winemaking. More surprisingly, he treated everyone in his orbit with genuine respect and consideration. His housekeeper, Mrs. Castagnano, was an elderly Italian woman who had worked for his family for 30 years, and who clearly regarded him as a beloved grandson rather than an employer. His bodyguards. Rachel learned that the men who seemed to appear and disappear around the building were not just security but family members and longtime associates, were treated more like brothers than employees. The penthouse itself was a revelation that unfolded over days of exploration. What had initially seemed like a luxurious prison revealed itself to be a home in the fullest sense, filled with family photographs that showed 3 generations of Rick, from his great-grandfather's immigration papers to wedding photos of cousins and siblings. There were children's drawings stuck to the refrigerator, gifts from nieces and nephews who clearly adored their Uncle Matteo. His kitchen was a chef's dream, stocked with ingredients that spoke of someone who genuinely enjoyed cooking rather than simply having food prepared for him. The spice rack alone contained items Rachel had never heard of, imported directly from Italy and used regularly based on the wear patterns on the containers. The living areas were filled with comfortable furniture that invited relaxation rather than impressing visitors. Books were scattered on tables where they had been set down mid-reading. Blankets were draped over chairs for impromptu naps, and everything spoke of a life that was lived rather than displayed. But it was the more private spaces that revealed the most about Matteo's character. His office contained not just the expected business materials, but also framed letters from community organizations thanking the Ricci family for donations, photographs of scholarship recipients whose educations had been funded by family money, and awards from various charities for community service. "You do a lot of legitimate charitable work," Rachel observed one afternoon as she helped him organize some papers. "More than you might expect," Matteo replied. "Money is just a tool, Rachel. It can be used to hurt people or to help them. I prefer to help when possible." "Tell me about your family," Rachel said one evening as they shared dinner and wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. "Tell me about your family." "My great-grandfather, Salvatore Ricci, came from Sicily in 1922. Matteo began, his eyes growing distant with memory. "He brought nothing but determination and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to build a better life for his children. Sicily in those days was not a good place for honest men. The government was corrupt. The economy was destroyed by war. And people like my great-grandfather had no opportunities except what they could create for themselves. So he came to America looking for legitimate work. He tried, believe me. He had been a skilled carpenter in Sicily, could build anything from furniture to houses. But when he arrived in New York, he found that the good construction jobs went to men who had been here longer, who spoke perfect English, who looked more American than he did." Matteo poured more wine, his movements automatic as he continued the story. "So Salvatore did what many immigrants did. He found work where it was available. During Prohibition, That meant moving alcohol for people who could pay well and who didn't ask questions about papers or accents or where you came from originally. Bootlegging. Bootlegging, yes, but also protection. The Italian neighborhoods were being preyed upon by Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, men who figured that immigrants wouldn't fight back. Salvatore and his friends proved them wrong. Rachel found herself leaning forward, captivated by this glimpse into a world she had only read about in history books. My grandfather, Antonio, he was the one who really built the organization into something structured. He understood that random violence was bad for business, that reputation and respect were more valuable than fear. He established territories, negotiated agreements with other families, created systems that prevented the kind of wars that destroyed neighborhoods. And your father? My father, Yeppy, he modernized everything, moved us into legitimate businesses, got involved in politics and community development. By the time I took over, we owned restaurants, construction companies, waste management firms. The illegal activities became a smaller and smaller part of what we did. But they didn't disappear entirely. No, Matteo admitted. Because there are always problems that cannot be solved through legal means. People who prey on the vulnerable, corrupt officials who cannot be voted out of office, businesses that exploit workers because they know no one will stop them. Rachel thought about her own family, hardworking, law-abiding people who had struggled constantly with bills, health problems, and systems that seemed designed to keep them down. Do you ever think about getting out, living a normal life? Matteo's expression grew distant. After Maria died, I considered it. But then I realized that normal life had nothing to offer me. My family, my responsibilities, my ability to help people. That is what gives my existence meaning. And what about personal happiness? Love, children. I had love. I lost it. As for children, Matteo shrugged. It would not be fair to bring children into this world, to make them targets for people who want to hurt me. Rachel felt a pang of sadness at the resignation in his voice. That's a lonely way to live. It is the price of power, and until recently, I thought it was a price I was willing to pay. The way he said "until recently" made Rachel's heart skip a beat. But before she could respond, Matteo's phone rang with a tone that made his expression immediately serious. "Excuse me," he said, answering the call and speaking in rapid Italian. Rachel couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the tension in Matteo's voice, could see the way his jaw tightened as he listened to whatever news he was receiving. When he hung up, his expression was grim. "They have found 2 of the 3 Russians who chased you. My people are handling the situation." Rachel felt a chill. Handling it how? In a way that ensures they will never threaten you again. Rachel understood what he meant, and the knowledge made her feel simultaneously safer and more complicit in violence than she had ever imagined possible. What about the 3rd man? Still searching, but he will be found. That night, Rachel lay in bed thinking about the men who had hunted her, who were now dead because of decisions made on her behalf. She should have felt horrified by the violence being committed in her name. But instead, she felt something closer to relief mixed with a complex understanding of justice that her previous life had never required her to consider. For the first time in her adult life, someone was ensuring her safety with absolute certainty. Someone was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect her without asking anything in return except that she allow herself to be protected. The next morning, Rachel met more members of Matteo's extended family when his sister Francesca arrived for what appeared to be a regular breakfast meeting. Francesca Ricci was a woman in her late 30s with the same dark eyes and commanding presence as her brother. But where Matteo's authority was quiet and controlled, Francesca's was sharp and direct. She was elegantly dressed in a way that suggested both wealth and serious business responsibilities, and she greeted Rachel with the kind of immediate assessment that reminded Rachel of the head nurses who ran hospital departments with iron efficiency. "So you are the nurse who has captured my brother's attention," Francesca said without preamble, settling at the breakfast table with the casual familiarity of someone who had been having meals in this apartment for decades. "I wouldn't say I captured anything," Rachel replied carefully. "I was in trouble, and Matteo helped me. Matteo helps many people. He does not usually invite them to live in his home indefinitely." Francesca's smile was knowing but not unkind. I am curious about what makes you different. Over breakfast, Rachel learned that Francesca managed the family's legitimate business interests, a portfolio that included restaurants, construction companies, import-export firms, and real estate development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She had an MBA from Columbia and spoke with the kind of sharp business acumen that would have been impressive in any corporate boardroom. People think that families like ours are just about violence and intimidation, Francesca explained as she reviewed some contracts that needed Matteo's signature. But the reality is that we are primarily business people. The violence, when it occurs, is usually about protecting our business interests from people who think they can take what we have built. Like the Russians. Exactly like the Russians. They see successful Italian businesses and think they can simply take them over through intimidation and murder. They do not understand that our success comes from generations of relationship building, community trust, and genuine value creation. Rachel watched the siblings work together, noting the easy collaboration and obvious mutual respect. Whatever moral complexities surrounded their business activities, it was clear that the Ritchie family operated as a genuine partnership built on love and loyalty. 2 weeks later, Matteo informed Rachel that the last of the Russians had been located and dealt with. She was safe to return to her old life if she chose to do so. "And if I don't choose to?" Rachel asked. They were sitting on Matteo's balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below them, sharing a bottle of wine and the kind of comfortable silence that had developed between them over their time together. "If you don't choose to return to your old life, then we figure out what your new life looks like. Together." Matteo turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "Rachel, these past 2 weeks with you have been the first time since Maria died that I have felt truly alive. You make me remember what it means to care for someone, to want to be better, to hope for things I thought were no longer possible." Rachel felt her heart racing. "Matteo, I know this is not the life you planned. I know my world is dangerous and complicated and morally ambiguous. But I also know that you are safer with me than you could ever be without me, and I am better with you than I have ever been without you." Rachel thought about her apartment in Queens, empty and waiting for her return. She thought about her job at the hospital, meaningful but exhausting and ultimately limited in its impact. She thought about the loneliness that had been her constant companion for years. Then she looked at the man who had saved her life, who had shown her a different way of living, who had spent 2 weeks treating her with more respect and genuine care than she had received from anyone in years. What would it mean exactly? Staying here, being part of your life? It would mean being cherished instead of just appreciated. It would mean having resources to help people in ways you never imagined possible. It would mean living without fear, without financial stress, without the constant struggle to survive. And in return, you give me something I thought I had lost forever. A reason to come home, someone to protect and care for. A future that includes more than just duty and responsibility. Rachel stood up and moved to the balcony railing, looking out over the city where her old life waited for her. Then she turned back to Matteo, seeing in his eyes the same hope and vulnerability she felt in her own heart. "I need you to promise me something," she said. "Anything. Promise me that if I stay, it's because I choose to stay. Not because I'm trapped, not because I'm afraid to leave, but because this is where I want to be." Matteo stood and moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I promise you that every day you stay will be because you choose me, just as I choose you." When Rachel kissed him, it was with the certainty of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Rachel Morgan Ritchie stood in the pediatric wing of a new children's hospital that bore the Ritchie family name, watching as the latest group of young patients enjoyed art therapy sessions in a room filled with natural light and child-friendly furniture that had been designed specifically for healing. The hospital was one of several charitable projects that Matteo had undertaken since Rachel joined his life, ways of using his resources and influence for unambiguously positive purposes. Rachel had been instrumental in designing the facility and recruiting staff, using her medical background to create something that filled gaps in the city's healthcare system. The children's hospital was just the beginning. They had also established a scholarship program for nursing students from immigrant families, funded a free clinic that provided health care to undocumented workers, and started a foundation that helped victims of domestic violence find safe housing and legal representation. You know, Rachel said as they watched a group of young patients laugh at a puppet show being performed by volunteer entertainers. 6 months ago, I thought the most I could ever do to help people was one patient at a time, one shift at a time. And now I'm helping to create systems that will help thousands of people over decades. Children who will grow up healthier because they had access to this hospital. Young women who will become nurses because they got scholarships. Families who will survive domestic violence because they found safe shelter. It was work that satisfied Rachel in ways her hospital job never had. Not because treating individual patients wasn't meaningful, but because she could now address the systemic problems that created so many of the cases she had seen in the pediatric ICU. Admiring your work? Mateo asked, joining her at the observation window. Our work, Rachel corrected. I never could have imagined something like this when I was working those 12-hour shifts at Manhattan General. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now doing more unambiguously good work than she ever had in her legitimate career, funded by money that came from sources the law would consider questionable. But the children being treated in this hospital didn't care about the moral complexities of their funding. They cared about receiving care that their families could afford. And do you miss it? Your old life? Rachel thought about the question seriously. She missed some things. The immediate satisfaction of hands-on patient care, the straightforward morality of medical treatment, the simplicity of problems that could be solved with medications and procedures. But she didn't miss the exhaustion, the constant financial stress, the loneliness, or the feeling that she could never do enough to make a real difference. And do you miss it? Your old life? Rachel thought about the question seriously because Mateo had asked it before and deserved an honest answer. She missed some things. The immediate satisfaction of hands-on patient care. The straightforward morality of medical treatment where helping people was always the right choice. The simplicity of problems that could be solved with medications and procedures. But she didn't miss the exhaustion that had become so constant. She had forgotten what it felt like to wake up rested. She didn't miss the financial stress that had colored every decision, from whether she could afford to replace her worn-out shoes to whether she could take time off when she was sick. She didn't miss the loneliness of coming home to an empty apartment after particularly difficult shifts with no one to talk to about the children she hadn't been able to save. Most of all, she didn't miss the feeling of powerlessness that had defined her old life. The knowledge that for every child she helped, there were dozens more being hurt by systems she was too small and too poor to change. I miss parts of it, Rachel said honestly, but I don't miss feeling like I was fighting a war I could never win, treating symptoms of problems I could never address. And the moral complications, the knowledge that some of our resources come from activities that your old life would have considered wrong. It was the question that had kept Rachel awake for weeks when she first decided to stay with Mateo, the ethical dilemma that she had turned over in her mind countless times. I've decided that morality isn't as simple as I used to think it was, Rachel said slowly. When I was working at Manhattan General, I treated gang members who had been shot by rival. I treated children who had been abused by parents who never faced justice because the system failed them. I cared for elderly individuals who had been beaten and robbed because the police couldn't keep their neighborhoods safe. And what did I learn from all that? That good intentions alone aren't enough if you don't have the power to make a real difference. That sometimes you're not choosing between right and wrong, but between different shades of imperfect solutions. Rachel paused, her gaze softening as she watched a group of children, alive and thriving thanks to the hospital she and Mateo had built. Your family's methods are, let's say, unconventional, she admitted, but the results speak volumes. This hospital will save more lives in a single year than I managed to save in my entire career as a nurse. Mateo wrapped his arms around her waist, drawing her back against his chest. Rachel felt a sense of security she'd never known existed before that terrifying night when she'd pounded on his door. Any regrets about knocking on the wrong door? He murmured, repeating a question that had become a playful inside joke between them. Rachel leaned into his warmth, a wave of memories washing over her. The frantic flight through the dark streets, the raw panic that had driven her to seek refuge at a stranger's door, the split-second decision that had irrevocably altered the course of her life. Just one, she replied. What's that? I regret that it took me 28 years and a brush with death to realize that sometimes the wrong choice leads you to exactly the right place. As they stood there, watching children play in the safety of a hospital that existed because of their unlikely partnership, Rachel reflected on the bizarre journey that had transformed her from an overworked, underpaid, and lonely nurse into a woman who could change systems, save lives on a grand scale, and fall asleep each night in the arms of a man who would literally kill to protect her. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, certainly not the conventional path she had been raised to follow. But it was a life brimming with meaning, a life built on a love that transcended moral complexities, and secured by a partnership that had irrevocably reshaped both of their worlds. Sometimes, Rachel mused, the most important doors are the ones you stumble upon in the dead of night, while running from dangers you never saw coming. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is precisely the person you need to save you. Not just from external threats, but from a life that was too small to contain your capacity for love, for helping others, and for changing the world. That's the story of Rachel Morgan, the pediatric nurse who knocked on the wrong door while fleeing for her life and found herself face to face with a man who changed everything with 5 simple words. From now on, you live here. Her story is a testament to the fact that love can blossom in the most unexpected places, that protection comes in many forms, and that sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the very one who can offer you the safety you never knew you were craving. Rachel and Mateo's love story reminds us that home isn't always where you begin. Sometimes, it's where you wind up when life takes a sharp, unforeseen turn. And sometimes, the wrong door leads to exactly the right life. If you found this incredible story captivating and you're eager to hear more tales of unexpected protection, life-altering mistakes, and love that triumphs over all odds, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share new stories every week about real people who discovered that fate has a funny way of guiding us precisely where we need to be, even when we're running for our lives. What did you think of Rachel and Mateo's story? Have you ever made a mistake that turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you? Would you have stayed with Mateo or returned to your old life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories resonate with your own experiences of unexpected love, life-changing decisions, and finding home in the most unlikely of places. Remember, sometimes when you're running from one danger, you run straight into the arms of your destiny. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.